Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson, and in this video I'm going to walk you through my photography workflow that I use when I do events and different kinds of promotional videos. Typically it's videography in my event coverage and promotional videos. So typically when I'm shooting events or a promotional video, I'm also switching between photography and video to capture both the event or the promotional video, to get some B-roll and to capture some of the more intimate moments using stills. And I use my Sony A7 IV, which is great hybrid camera for this type of work, as I create and capture high quality stills with a 33 megapixel aspect of the A7 IV, and also shoot in RAW format so that I can capture a high dynamic range and get an uncompressed image from the camera. So in this video I'm going to walk you through my workflow in terms of how I capture the photos with my Sony A7 IV, but then also once I'm home and I'm processing the photography, how I process it. So how I go about using Topaz AI and also using Lightroom, the classic version. And then finally how I export that into JPEG, and you can create these dynamic slideshows in Final Cut Pro. So the first thing to note is I use my Sony A7 IV, which is a hybrid camera, and I've had this camera for roughly roughly 3 years. And this camera allows you to capture 33 megapixels in the image. And what I do is I'll capture it using the RAW format. And so in the Sony menu settings, you can select the RAW format. And when you shoot in RAW, you're capturing the uncompressed image, and it allows you to have more dynamic range, as well as 10 to 12 bit color, versus with the JPEG you're only getting roughly 8 bit. So with the higher aspect of either 10 or 12 bit format, you're able to capture more colors and have a more dynamic color palette in terms of when you're capturing the image. And so the RAW format allows you for the highest quality of the image and allows you for the most flexibility in the post-processing. So that's why I shoot in RAW. Obviously the files are much bigger when you're shooting in RAW, but it's usually with these higher, I use a 128 gigabyte memory card, which allows for quite a few pictures even in RAW. I'm capturing the images in 3:1 aspect ratio, which is the highest format in terms of capturing the image with the Sony A7 IV. And with the images, I'm also not going to go above typically 6400 in terms of the ISO. I'll use the eye autofocus so that I'm ensuring that I'm capturing the subject and ensuring that the image is sharp and capturing the subject just as is in terms of no blurriness or lens distortion. Usually I'm using continuous autofocus, and you can use a spot focus in terms of the focus area, so that there's different ways to use the different focus with the camera, but I'm usually either relying on the wide focus or on the spot focus. So once I've captured the image in my camera and I've covered the event either with a promotional video or with the event coverage, I will come back home and take those images off and I'll import them into Lightroom. And when I do that, I'm importing them first onto my computer or sometimes on a fast SSD. Typically, in order to get the fastest speeds, I'm going to import it onto my MacBook. I have two computers essentially. I have the Mac Studio, which has a 1 terabyte drive, but with my MacBook I have a 4 terabyte drive, which often doesn't run out of room, so I'm very much able to import the raw images. And then I open them up in Lightroom. The first process I do is I create my selects. So I'm selecting the images that I think are the best ones. Typically it could be a quarter of the images or even smaller than that. Typically, depending on the event, it could be maybe I'm capturing about 500, 600 photos, and then I'm selecting maybe 80 to 90 of those photos. Some might even select less, but I like to capture lots of images, and then from that I allow the client to decide which images they like. And with obviously digital, you're able to take many photos, and so it's really not a limitation to, I think, edit so many photos. But once I import them into Lightroom, what I find is that I want to speed track my workflow, right? And so some might say you shouldn't rely on the auto settings that Lightroom has, which is basically it allows you to adjust the exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. And then you're also able to auto correct the vibrance, clarity, and saturation of your image. And you can actually batch process the images. So once you do a select, you can batch the images and auto edit them basically by using the auto feature and analysis with Lightroom's. They have an AI platform, Sensi, I believe is the name. That engine does a really good job at getting a base correction. But of course, once that base correction is created, I will refine the edits usually, and I'll select different aspects so I can create different masks on the subject, on the background, on different aspects of the images. And this allows you to refine the edits of both the subject, background, it could be on the eyes, it could be on anything that you really want in terms of the image. So that's a very powerful aspect of Lightroom. But of course, you don't want to, for the audience or for the viewer, for them to necessarily know, obviously, that you've edited the mask, or you don't want to accentuate to the subject too much, or whatever you're masking, you want it to blend in the image and for it not to be noticeable. So you got to be careful not to overexpose the mask or create too much contrast between the subject and the background, for example. But so once I do a base correction using the auto feature, actually to rewind, I actually do that step after this next step. So the first step I do is I select the images I like, the ones that I favorite. So I go through Lightroom and I favorite all the images I like. And then what I do is I use Topaz AI to retain the raw quality and get the best workflow. I used to do some edits and then I upload it to Topaz AI. But what I've learned is that in Lightroom in Lightroom you go to the built-in extras feature and you select process with Topaz AI. So in File, you go to Built-in Extras, and then you click Process with Topaz AI. Then it will give you the option to allow you to edit them, to override the image. So the ones that you selected, you want to overwrite them. And so any changes you make in Topaz AI, it's going to override the selects that you created in Lightroom. And so you can't go back. And once you make the corrections in Topaz AI, it's basically the corrections of the image. Of course, the raw image is likely on your disk or on a backup, but what I typically do is I'll select overwrite because I don't really want to duplicate the images. In Topaz AI, it's a very powerful program. What I do is because I'm thinking about speed, right? If I was to select a few photos and I really wanted to ensure that it's the best quality of the image, I would go in there and manually change some of the features in Topaz AI. But what I found is I use Topaz AI for a very much basic base correction, and really it's reducing the noise, especially if it's a dark scene or a dark image. I want to correct for the noise that's in the image. And Topaz AI has a very powerful AI engine that's trained off of many other photos, and they have different aspects of Topaz AI. And one of the key features is the denoising AI. They also have sharpening AI and gigapixel AI. So as the titles say, it's basically allows you to denoise the image, sharpen the image, and also if you want to enlarge the image as well. It does a host of things. It allows you to correct things such as noise, color noise, soft focus, motion blur or lens blur. The key thing too is it also detects faces, so you can do some base corrections to your faces. And so once I import from Lightroom using that file to edit in Topaz AI, then in Topaz AI typically I will use their autopilot feature, which allows you to batch edit the images. And so typically what I'll do is I might have about 80 images, and then I will autopilot those images, allow for the AI to do its magic in terms of editing the image and getting that base correction. I'll do that. I'll export that, or I guess basically imports it back into Lightroom. And once it's in Lightroom, I have those base corrections using the Topaz AI. So once the images are back in Lightroom Classic, I then will, in the develop module or the develop feature of Lightroom, I will then do that batch auto correction. And so that gives me a head start in terms of allowing Lightroom to edit, like I mentioned, all the different aspects of the image. And then what I use is a LUT by Profile LUTs, and so these give me a very much teal and orange look to a lot of my images. And so typically I like a lot of Stu's is a store, and so I'll link that in the description. But I really like a lot of the look in terms of Stu's looks, so I've used his LUTs for some times. And so for those who don't know, LUTs is a lookup table. So it allows you to create a basic look to your images. And so I will typically apply his LUTs to most of my images, and I'll typically lessen them to usually around 40, 50 to 60%. And after that, I will then typically copy a lot of the different aspects of the image in terms of the color correction, the profile, as well as noise and sharpening. And sometimes you can even do the masks in terms of once you copy all those features and then paste it onto the next image, it allows you to also, it does a smart feature where it intuits what a mask was in the previous image and applies that same or similar mask to the next image. And so you gotta maybe double check that actually occurs and how they actually apply, or how the AI applies that mask. But I found this feature actually quite helpful so that you're not constantly creating so many different types of masks. I'll do usually an S-curve to lower some of the shadows and the blacks and up some of the midtones and highlights. And that's a typical aspect of when you edit an image. I'll add typically some noise. Typically I don't have to denoise the image. Lightroom does it, has its own denoiser, and sometimes I will rely on that. Usually does a really good job. But typically with the Sony A7 IV, because it's usually very good in low light, and because I'm usually shooting at a low f-stop, it allows you to typically not have so much noise. But some images, especially if I'm shooting at night, may have some noise, or if I'm cropping into the image, it might be adding some more noise, or at least making it more clear that there is noise in the image. So sometimes I'll first be relying on Topaz AI, but even then I might actually add, if it's needed, the denoising feature in Lightroom. And I don't know if that's necessarily the best to first work in Topaz AI and then also add another denoising, but at least because it's already in a DNG file, it typically holds up pretty well with the Lightroom denoiser. And other aspects of my Lightrooms, so I'll go through all the selects, I'll kind of see them overall, like which ones I like, and out of the 80 images or so, let's say, I might refine a few, and maybe if I really don't like an image, I might delete it or unselect it. But once I got all my images that I like, I will then export it from Lightroom as a JPEG using the highest quality settings, and that then so my final aspect is I will usually give those images to the client. Sometimes I'm also shooting a promotional video, or could be an event coverage. I find it very helpful or nice to have images as well as B-roll. And so when you apply the images to Final Cut Pro, I will create a slideshow. I have another video I'll link in the description of how I go about actually creating these slideshows. So if you want to check that out, definitely check that tutorial out. But very simply, I will lessen the time of the image. So typically when you import it, I believe it's like roughly 5 seconds per image. And so I will link in the description the tutorial I created of how I create slideshows. But basically that's my workflow in terms of capturing the image with the Sony A7 IV, the 33 megapixels, using the RAW format and the HEIF format. In this video, I walked you through the different steps, and I explained how I also use AI aspects in my workflow. And I think that this is a very quick way to capture high quality stills for your projects, and allows you to really enhance a lot of your projects, as I think having B-roll as well as your A-roll, and then also having high quality stills really, I think, helps. That's very just robust way to add to your projects, and I think really typically and it's very pleasing to the eye, I think, just to have a juxtaposition of B-roll with video, as well as JPEG images to accentuate whatever story you're trying to tell.